I don't know what to do. Are you sure you know what you're doing? This life will not end in this brightly lit room.
Rich family rejected every veteran nanny until she saved their disabled son's life. The mahogany doors of the Whitaker mansion closed with finality. As the 15th nanny candidate walked away, her military bearing no match for Eleanor Whitaker's condescending smile and polite dismissal. "Too old?" Eleanor murmured to her husband Charles as they watched the former Navy corpsman navigate their marble steps with careful precision, her prosthetic leg barely noticeable, but apparently disqualifying in their world of aesthetic perfection. 7-year-old Lucas Whitaker lay in his specialized bed upstairs, unaware that his parents' prejudices were preventing him from receiving the care he desperately needed. His severe cerebral palsy and seizure disorder had overwhelmed 12 previous nannies, each departing after medical emergencies they couldn't handle left them traumatized and inadequate. What the Whitakers didn't know was that Staff Sergeant Maya Reynolds, former Army combat medic, was about to become their last hope. The woman they'd reject for her disability and military background would soon prove that their son's life depended not on appearances, but on the battle-tested skills that only someone who'd saved lives under fire could provide. The Whitaker Mansion in Beverly Hills, California, stood as testament to generational wealth, built on aerospace manufacturing contracts. Its perfectly manicured grounds and museum-quality interior, reflecting a family whose success had insulated them from understanding struggle or sacrifice. Eleanor and Charles Whitaker lived in a bubble of privilege where appearance, pedigree, and social standing determined worth, while their son Lucas existed in a different reality, where survival depended on medical expertise and unconditional dedication. Lucas embodied the cruel randomness of genetics that no amount of wealth could prevent or cure. His 7 years marked by seizures that could strike without warning, muscle spasticity that required constant physical therapy, and cognitive challenges that demanded patience and specialized understanding. His room was equipped with hospital-grade monitoring equipment and emergency medications that most civilian caregivers found intimidating, while his needs exceeded what traditional nanny training could address. The 12 nannies who had previously attempted to care for Lucas represented the best that elite agencies could provide: graduates of prestigious child care programs with impressive references and impeccable manners. But their education hadn't prepared them for the reality of pediatric medical emergencies, the split-second decisions that meant the difference between stabilization and catastrophe, or the emotional resilience required to care for a child whose condition could deteriorate without warning. Staff Sergeant Maya Reynolds carried wounds both visible and invisible from her 3 deployments. As an Army combat medic, her service record, including 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart, earned during a convoy attack that had shattered her left leg and ended her military career. At 35, she walked with a slight limp that spoke of sacrifice rather than limitation, her prosthetic leg a reminder of the IED blast that had taken her limb, but not her spirit or her commitment to saving lives. Her transition to civilian life had been challenging in ways that military discharge planning had never addressed, finding purpose that matched the intensity and importance of battlefield medicine. Civilian employers who understood that her disability was irrelevant to her capabilities, and meaningful work that utilized skills that few people possessed. Her decision to pursue pediatric special needs care was both practical and emotional, combining her medical training with her desire to serve vulnerable populations who needed advocates rather than just caregivers. Eleanor Whitaker represented the well-intentioned prejudice of those whose privilege had never required them to look beyond surface appearances, her charity work and social consciousness masking deep-seated assumptions about military service disability and the kind of people suitable for caring for her precious son. Her rejection of veteran candidates wasn't malicious, but reflexive, based on stereotypes about damaged soldiers and concerns about exposing Lucas to negative influences. Charles Whitaker embodied the business world's obsession with credentials and appearances, his success built on reading people and situations quickly while making decisions based on first impressions and measurable qualifications. His approach to hiring caregivers for Lucas reflected the same methodology he used for executive positions, seeking candidates who looked the part rather than those who could perform it. The broader context was a society where military service was honored in abstract but misunderstood in practice, where disabled veterans faced systematic employment discrimination despite laws designed to protect them, and where families in crisis often rejected the very people best qualified to help them. The intersection of wealth, privilege, and genuine need created conditions where prejudice could literally be life-threatening. The collision between Maya's qualifications and the Whitakers' preconceptions was building toward a confrontation that would test whether parental love could overcome social conditioning and whether desperate circumstances could force recognition of worth that transcended appearances and challenged fundamental assumptions about capability, service, and the true meaning of strength. The call from Elite Family Services came on a Tuesday morning when Maya had begun to wonder if civilian employment would ever utilize the skills that had kept soldiers alive in Afghanistan's most dangerous regions. The agency's tone was apologetic and hesitant, suggesting that the Whitaker family was particular about their requirements and that previous candidates had been unsuccessful due to the challenging nature of their son's needs. Mrs. Reynolds, I want to be transparent about this family's preferences, said Placement Coordinator Jennifer Walsh, her careful language revealing the discrimination that Maya had encountered repeatedly since beginning her job search. They've been quite specific about wanting someone younger with a more traditional appearance. Your military background and, well, your injury might be concerns for them. Maya's response was professional but firm, drawing on military training that had taught her to address prejudice directly while maintaining composure. Ms. Walsh, my qualifications include 3 years of pediatric emergency medicine in combat zones, certification in childhood seizure management, and experience with traumatic brain injury rehabilitation. If the family is more concerned about my prosthetic leg than my ability to save their son's life, perhaps they need to reconsider their priorities. The interview was scheduled for the following afternoon, with Maya arriving at the Whitaker mansion in her best civilian attire, while carrying a portfolio that documented training and experience that exceeded anything the family had previously encountered. Her approach to the estate revealed both the grandeur that wealth could create and the isolation it often produced, the perfectly maintained grounds suggesting control over an environment that Lucas's medical condition had taught them was ultimately uncontrollable. Eleanor Whitaker's initial reaction was visible and predictable, her eyes immediately focusing on Maya's slight limp before moving to assess age, appearance, and the general impression that fell short of her unstated but rigid requirements. The preliminary conversation was polite but cool, with questions that revealed more about the family's biases than about Maya's qualifications. Ms. Reynolds Lucas requires very specialized care from someone who can handle unexpected situations. Eleanor began her euphemisms, failing to disguise skepticism about Maya's physical capabilities. His previous caregivers have found his needs quite overwhelming and were concerned about anyone who might not be able to respond quickly during emergencies. Maya's response was direct and educational, combining professional credentials with personal understanding that civilian caregivers typically lacked. Mrs. Whitaker, I've treated pediatric casualties under mortar fire while managing multiple critical patients simultaneously. Lucas's seizure disorder and mobility challenges are conditions I've managed in circumstances far more stressful than a Beverly Hills home with full medical support and emergency services minutes away. The demonstration that followed was unprecedented in the Whitakers' hiring process, with Maya requesting permission to review Lucas's medical records, emergency protocols, and equipment, while explaining how her military training applied directly to his specific needs. Her assessment was thorough and clinical, identifying gaps in previous care plans while suggesting improvements based on battlefield medicine principles. Your son's rescue medication administration could be streamlined, and his positioning during seizures could be optimized to prevent secondary injuries. Maya explained while reviewing equipment that she understood better than most civilian medical professionals. My combat experience includes pediatric trauma cases, where quick thinking and proper technique meant the difference between survival and catastrophic outcomes. Charles Whitaker's business instincts recognized competence when he saw it, but his social conditioning created conflict between practical assessment and aesthetic preferences. Ms. Reynolds, your qualifications are impressive, but Lucas has been traumatized by previous caregivers who couldn't handle his condition. We need someone who won't be overwhelmed or frankly frightening to a child who's already dealing with significant challenges. The implication that her disability would frighten their disabled son revealed prejudices that Maya had encountered throughout her civilian transition, assumptions that equated physical difference with psychological damage or professional inadequacy. Her response was measured but pointed, addressing misconceptions while maintaining the professionalism that might secure employment that Lucas desperately needed. Mr. Whitaker, children with disabilities often respond positively to caregivers who understand adaptation and resilience. My experience has taught me that strength comes in many forms, and Lucas might benefit from seeing that challenges can be overcome rather than hidden or stigmatized. The hiring decision came after 2 weeks of deliberation that revealed the depth of the Whitakers' internal conflict between their social prejudices and their son's desperate medical needs. Lucas had experienced 3 seizure episodes during Maya's interview period, each resulting in emergency room visits that could have been prevented with proper, immediate care. The reality of his condition was finally overriding their aesthetic preferences. "We're willing to offer you a trial period," Eleanor announced during the callback meeting, her language carefully chosen to maintain the illusion that Maya was fortunate to be considered rather than acknowledging that they were desperate for someone with her qualifications. Lucas's needs are quite specific, and we want to ensure that you can handle the physical demands of his care. Maya's acceptance was professional and confident understanding that she was being hired despite rather than because of her military background and disability. Her first day was structured like a military operation, thorough briefing on Lucas's medical history, detailed review of emergency protocols, and systematic assessment of equipment and supplies that would be essential during crisis situations. The introduction to Lucas was carefully managed by Eleanor, who hovered nervously as if expecting Maya's presence to somehow traumatize a child who had already been through more medical procedures than most adults experienced in a lifetime. But Lucas's reaction was immediate and positive, his 7-year-old instincts recognizing someone whose calm competence felt different from the anxiety that had characterized previous caregivers. "Are you a soldier?" Lucas asked with the direct curiosity that children used to cut through adult euphemisms, his question revealing intelligence that his physical limitations often obscured. "My leg doesn't work right either. Did yours get hurt in the war?" Maya's response was honest and age-appropriate, creating connection through shared experience rather than pity or condescension. "I was a soldier, and yes, my leg was injured while I was helping other soldiers who were hurt. But I learned that having parts that don't work perfectly doesn't stop us from doing important things. Sometimes it even makes us stronger." The conversation that followed was the beginning of a therapeutic relationship that transcended traditional caregiver-child dynamics, with Lucas responding to Maya's military bearing and practical approach to limitations with enthusiasm that his parents had never witnessed. Her treatment of his disability as fact rather than tragedy created space for him to express frustrations and fears that he'd never been able to articulate. The first medical crisis came during Maya's second week, when Lucas experienced a complex partial seizure while they were working on physical therapy exercises in the mansion's medical suite. Eleanor's immediate panic and Charles's frantic phone calls to emergency services created exactly the kind of chaotic environment that made medical emergencies more dangerous than necessary. But Maya's response was textbook combat medicine adapted to pediatric care, her military training asserting itself as she managed Lucas's seizure while simultaneously calming his parents and coordinating with emergency responders who arrived to find the situation already stabilized. Her competence during crisis was both professional and reassuring, demonstrating capabilities that civilian medical training rarely achieved. "Is he okay? Should we take him to the hospital?" Eleanor asked, through tears that revealed months of accumulated stress and fear, her privileged life having never prepared her for the helplessness that medical emergencies created in even the wealthiest families. Maya's assessment was thorough and confident, her explanation combining clinical precision with emotional support that addressed both Lucas's medical needs and his parents' psychological trauma. The seizure lasted 90 seconds, well within normal parameters for his condition. His vitals are stable, his medication levels are appropriate, and his recovery is proceeding normally. This is actually a progress. Previous episodes lasted longer and required more intensive intervention. The education that followed was comprehensive and transformative, with Maya teaching the Whitakers how to recognize seizure patterns, administer emergency medications, and provide supportive care that could prevent minor episodes from becoming major crises. Her approach was systematic and empowering, giving them tools that reduced fear while improving outcomes. But the most significant change was in Lucas himself, whose confidence and communication skills improved dramatically under Maya's care. Her military structure provided predictability that helped him manage anxiety, while her matter-of-fact approach to disability encouraged him to push boundaries that previous caregivers had been afraid to challenge. "Maya makes me feel like I can do things," Lucas told his parents during a family dinner that had become possible because his increased stability allowed for more normal activities. "She says having broken parts doesn't mean being broken, and she teaches me how to be stronger." The transformation was visible and measurable, with Lucas's seizure frequency decreasing, while his physical therapy progress accelerated under Maya's guidance. Her combination of medical expertise and military discipline created structure that benefited his neurological condition, while her emotional intelligence addressed psychological needs that previous caregivers had never recognized. Charles Whitaker's business assessment of Maya's performance was overwhelmingly positive, with metrics that couldn't be argued away by social prejudices. Emergency room visits down 70%, therapy goals exceeded behavioral improvements documented by every specialist we consult. Whatever reservations we had about hiring her have been completely invalidated by results. But Eleanor's resistance was more complex and personal. Her identity as Lucas's primary protector feeling threatened by someone whose competence made her own limitations obvious. "She's very capable, but I worry about Lucas becoming too attached to someone who might not be permanent. Military people move around, and disabled people often have their own issues that could affect their reliability." The critique revealed prejudices that success hadn't eliminated assumptions about veterans and disabled individuals that ignored evidence of Maya's commitment and effectiveness. The tension was building toward confrontation that would test whether gratitude could overcome bias, and whether Lucas's needs would finally take precedence over his parents' comfort with conventional appearances. The crisis erupted on a Thursday evening when Lucas experienced the most severe seizure of his life, a status epilepticus episode that threatened permanent brain damage or death if not treated immediately and expertly. The seizure began during his evening routine and quickly escalated beyond anything the family had previously witnessed, with convulsions that wouldn't stop and breathing complications that required immediate medical intervention. Eleanor's screaming and Charles's panicked attempts to call 911 created chaos that made professional medical response more difficult, while Lucas's condition deteriorated rapidly toward the kind of neurological emergency that killed children whose caregivers weren't trained for battlefield medicine. The mansion's wealth and equipment meant nothing without someone who could use them effectively under life-threatening pressure. Maya's response was immediate and comprehensive, her combat medic training activating as she assessed Lucas's condition while simultaneously managing his airway, administering emergency medications, and coordinating with paramedics who were still 20 minutes away in Beverly Hills traffic. Her military bearing and clinical precision cut through family panic while providing exactly the kind of expert intervention that kept Lucas alive. "Eleanor, I need you to time the seizure while I manage his airway," Maya commanded with authority that brooked no argument, her instructions clear and specific, while her hands worked to prevent aspiration and maintain oxygen flow. "Charles, get the emergency seizure protocol from his medical file and read me the medication dosages. We have minutes before this becomes irreversible. But the family's response revealed how deeply their prejudices ran even during life-threatening crisis. Eleanor's hysteria included accusations that Maya's military background had somehow caused or worsened Lucas's condition, while Charles's business-oriented mind began calculating liability and wondering whether hiring a disabled veteran had created legal exposure rather than medical benefit. This never happened with his other caregivers. Eleanor screamed through tears that mixed genuine fear with misplaced blame. Maybe your war trauma is affecting him, or your medications are creating some kind of negative environment. This is exactly why we were hesitant to hire someone with your background. The accusations were both medically ignorant and morally devastating. Attacking someone whose expertise was literally saving their son's life while revealing that gratitude and results couldn't overcome fundamental biases about military service and disability. Maya's response had to balance professional focus with personal hurt, maintaining clinical effectiveness while processing rejection that cut deeper than physical wounds. Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker Lucas is experiencing status epilepticus, a neurological emergency that requires immediate medical intervention. Maya explained while continuing to provide care that was keeping their son alive. This condition is related to his underlying seizure disorder, not environmental factors. My priority right now is preventing brain damage or death, which requires your cooperation rather than your blame. The darkest moment came when the seizure continued beyond the critical 5-minute threshold, entering territory where permanent neurological damage became increasingly likely with each passing second. Maya's combat experience had prepared her for this level of medical crisis, but treating a child she'd grown to love while his parents questioned her competence created emotional complexity that battlefield medicine had never demanded. The advanced intervention Maya implemented was beyond civilian medical training, including techniques she'd learned treating pediatric casualties in Afghanistan, where evacuation times were measured in hours rather than minutes. Her ability to provide ICU-level care using equipment available in the Whitaker's medical suite was the difference between Lucas surviving with minimal damage and experiencing catastrophic outcomes. His breathing is stabilizing, but the seizure activity is still too intense, Maya reported while adjusting medication dosages and monitoring vital signs that most civilian caregivers wouldn't have known how to interpret. I'm implementing advanced protocols that should break the seizure pattern before paramedics arrive. This is exactly the kind of situation my military training prepared me for. But even as Lucas's condition began improving under Maya's expert care, Eleanor's trauma manifested an increased hostility toward the person saving her son's life. We never should have hired someone with PTSD and physical disabilities to care for a medically fragile child. This is our fault for letting desperation override good judgment about appropriate caregivers. The psychological impact on Maya was profound and immediate, with professional success being overshadowed by personal rejection that triggered her own PTSD symptoms related to being blamed for casualties she'd worked desperately to save. The family whose son she was rescuing was treating her like a liability rather than a lifeline, creating emotional trauma that complicated her medical response. The arrival of paramedics provided validation of Maya's interventions, with emergency medical technicians recognizing advanced care that had prevented tragedy while expressing amazement at the civilian equipment and expertise they'd encountered. Their professional assessment contradicted every accusation the Whitakers had made, proving that Maya's background had been asset rather than liability. "Ma'am, whatever you did in those first few minutes saved this child's life," paramedic supervisor Jennifer Martinez told Maya while preparing Lucas for transport. That level of seizure management is what we'd expect from hospital ICU staff, not civilian caregivers. Where did you learn pediatric emergency medicine? The transformation began in the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, where Dr. Patricia Chin, the attending neurologist, provided medical assessment that would forever change how the Whitakers understood Maya's qualifications and their own prejudices. Her evaluation of Lucas's condition and the care he'd received was both clinical and devastating to assumptions that military service and disability somehow diminished rather than enhanced caregiving capabilities. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker, I need you to understand that your son experienced status epilepticus, a neurological emergency, with mortality rates approaching 15%, when not treated immediately and expertly." Dr. Chen explained with the authority of someone whose career had been built on saving children from exactly this kind of crisis. The interventions provided by his caregiver were textbook emergency medicine that prevented brain damage or death. The medical testimony continued with details that made Maya's expertise undeniable, while exposing the ignorance behind Eleanor's accusations. The airway management medication timing and neurological assessment documented in the paramedic report represent advanced pediatric emergency care. Most civilian caregivers, including many nurses, wouldn't have known how to provide this level of intervention. But the most powerful moment came when Dr. Chen directly addressed the family's concerns about Maya's military background and disability. Ms. Reynolds' combat medical training appears to have prepared her for exactly this type of pediatric emergency. Her experience treating trauma casualties under pressure translated directly to saving your son's life. I'd recommend you consider yourself fortunate to have someone with her qualifications caring for Lucas. The hospital vigil that followed became a period of reflection and revelation for the Whitakers, with Lucas's stable condition providing space for them to process how their prejudices had nearly cost them the only caregiver capable of managing their son's complex needs. The intensive care environment filled with medical professionals whose competence transcended appearance forced recognition that they'd been judging capability by completely irrelevant criteria. Eleanor's breakdown came during Lucas's second night in the hospital, her accumulated guilt and fear manifesting in tears that mixed gratitude with shame. "Maya, I said terrible things when you were saving Lucas's life. I blamed you for his condition when you were the only reason he survived. I don't know how to apologize for being so wrong about everything." Maya's response revealed both professional grace and personal strength that had been forged through experiences far more challenging than civilian prejudice misses. Whitaker fear makes people say things they don't mean. What matters now is Lucas's recovery and making sure this doesn't happen again. My job is caring for your son, not managing your comfort with my background or appearance. The conversation that followed was honest in ways that transformed their relationship from employer-employee to collaborative partnership, focused on Lucas's well-being. Eleanor's questions about Maya's military service revealed genuine curiosity rather than suspicion, while her inquiries about disability accommodation demonstrated growing understanding of adaptation rather than limitation. I realize I know nothing about military medicine or what combat medics actually do. Eleanor admitted with humility that her privileged background had never required her to develop. I made assumptions based on movies and stereotypes rather than understanding that your training was exactly what Lucas needed. Charles Whitaker's transformation was equally profound, but characteristically systematic. His business mind now focused on how to retain someone whose value had been proven beyond doubt. Maya, we want to offer you a permanent position with full benefits medical support for your own needs and whatever accommodation you require. We also want to formalize your role as Lucas's primary medical coordinator. But Maya's response surprised them with requirements that went beyond employment terms to address the fundamental issues that had created their initial problems. I appreciate the offer, but I need assurance that you understand what you're hiring. I'm not just a nanny. I'm a medical professional whose disability and military service are assets rather than liabilities. Lucas deserves caregivers who are valued for their capabilities rather than tolerated despite their backgrounds. The negotiation that followed established new standards for the family's approach to disability, military service, and professional competence that would influence every future interaction. Maya's conditions included recognition of her expertise, accommodation for her physical needs, and commitment to treating her as medical professional rather than domestic employee. The public reckoning came when the Whitakers began sharing their story with their Beverly Hills social circle, using their experience to challenge assumptions about veterans, disabled individuals, and the kind of people qualified to care for special needs children. Their advocacy was both personal and political, transforming private prejudice into public education. We almost lost our son because we were more concerned with appearances than qualifications. Eleanor told her charity board with candor that shocked peers accustomed to carefully managed social images. Maya Reynolds saved Lucas's life using skills that her military service and medical training provided. Our prejudices nearly cost us everything. The broader impact extended through their social and professional networks as other wealthy families reconsidered their own hiring practices and assumptions about veterans seeking civilian employment. The Whitakers' influence created opportunities for military personnel whose qualifications had been dismissed by employers focused on credentials rather than capabilities. The medical community's recognition of Maya's expertise led to consulting opportunities that utilized her unique combination of pediatric emergency medicine and special needs care. Her experience became case study material for civilian medical training, while her techniques influenced pediatric emergency protocols throughout the Los Angeles medical system. Lucas's recovery was remarkable and sustained, with his seizure disorder becoming more manageable under Maya's expert care, while his developmental progress accelerated through therapeutic approaches that combined medical precision with military discipline. His confidence and communication skills reflected the security that came from being cared for by someone whose competence was absolute. The annual Lucas Whitaker Foundation for Veteran Caregivers became the family's vehicle for supporting military personnel transitioning to civilian healthcare careers, with scholarships, training programs, and placement services that addressed employment discrimination while meeting community needs for specialized care providers. 5 years later, Maya had established the first training program specifically designed to prepare military medics for civilian special needs, caregiving her curriculum, combining combat medical experience with pediatric specialty care that created employment opportunities for hundreds of veterans while serving families whose children required expert medical attention. The testimonial dinner honoring Maya's service became an annual event that brought together military families, medical professionals, and community leaders whose lives had been touched by her example of how service continued beyond uniform into civilian careers that saved lives and challenged assumptions about capability and worth. The final scene was both personal triumph and institutional change as Maya stood beside Lucas, now thriving in middle school, despite his continuing challenges at the graduation ceremony for her veteran caregiver training program. The boy whose life she'd saved had become advocate for others like him, while the family that had rejected her had become champions for recognizing ability beyond appearance. Maya didn't just save my life. Lucas told the assembled graduates, his words carrying wisdom that exceeded his years. She taught my family that heroes don't always look like what we expect, and that the strongest people are often those who've learned to overcome challenges that would defeat others. Sometimes, the best person for the job is the one you almost didn't hire. The audience, including dozens of military families, medical professionals, and community leaders whose perceptions had been changed by the Whitakers' journey, understood that they were witnessing transformation that transcended individual success to encompass fundamental change in how society valued service capability and the courage to challenge prejudice when lives depended on getting beyond appearances to recognize true qualifications. The Maya Reynolds case became a watershed moment for veteran employment in specialized caregiving roles, demonstrating that military medical training provided qualifications that civilian healthcare often couldn't match, while challenging societal assumptions about disability service and professional competence. Her success influenced hiring practices throughout the caregiving industry while creating new pathways for veterans whose skills were perfectly matched to civilian needs. The immediate consequences transformed the Whitakers from symbols of privileged prejudice to advocates for veteran employment and disability rights. Their public acknowledgement of error, creating space for other wealthy families to examine their own biases while recognizing the value of military experience in civilian caregiving roles. Their foundation became a leading supporter of veteran transition programs throughout California. The medical community's recognition of Maya's innovations led to integration of combat medicine techniques into civilian pediatric emergency care, with her protocols being taught in nursing schools and medical residency programs throughout the United States. Her approach influenced treatment standards while demonstrating that military medical training could enhance rather than compete with civilian health care. The federal policy impact included enhanced funding for veteran caregiver training programs and tax incentives for families hiring veterans for specialized care roles, with the Department of Veterans Affairs expanding services that connected military medical personnel with civilian families whose children required expert attention. The programs created thousands of employment opportunities while meeting critical community needs. The special needs community transformation was equally significant, with families throughout the country seeking caregivers whose military medical backgrounds prepared them for complex medical emergencies and challenging behavioral situations. The demand created new career paths for veterans while improving care quality for children whose needs exceeded traditional nanny training. The educational revolution extended to civilian medical training, as combat medicine techniques were incorporated into emergency response curricula, with Maya's case demonstrating that military experience could enhance civilian medical education rather than competing with traditional training approaches. Medical schools throughout the country adopted her teaching methods, while veterans became valuable additions to healthcare training faculties. The cultural impact challenged fundamental assumptions about disability, military service, and professional capability, with Maya's story becoming symbol of how prejudice could literally be life-threatening, while proving that strength came in forms that conventional wisdom failed to recognize. Her example inspired broader conversations about veteran employment and disability accommodation. The research that emerged from documenting Maya's methods influenced academic understanding of pediatric emergency care and the effectiveness of military medical training in civilian applications. Peer-reviewed studies validated her techniques while contributing to medical knowledge that enhanced treatment approaches for special needs children throughout American healthcare. The international influence extended to allied nations whose veteran services adopted similar caregiver training programs based on the American model, with Maya's approach influencing veteran employment strategies in Canada, Australia, and European Union countries that faced similar challenges integrating military medical personnel into civilian healthcare roles. The enduring message transcended individual triumph to encompass fundamental truths about service and capability. Military medical training provided qualifications that civilian employers desperately needed. Disabled veterans often possessed capabilities that exceeded their physical limitations. And the strongest families were those who chose competence over appearance when lives depended on recognizing true qualifications rather than superficial prejudices.